morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you guys are at. I hope you're having a fantastic day. It's SoulSaint here, and we got some more updates, some more news, some more little bit of tidbits here and there that have to do with what's coming up in the near future. And if you haven't already seen it, we did a breakdown on the video release that they had a teaser for The Great Void, which is going to be the next big content that's going to be coming out. And I wanted to kind of break down some of the things that we saw, as well as they kind of gave some hints towards some things here and there. And what better way to start it without looking at their recent posts that have been very, very interesting. And I wanted to start with this because there's actually a little bit of a timeline inside the note itself, as well as something that was dropped to us. And I got to give a shout out to all the clan leaders here. If you haven't already talked to them, there is some news that are coming out. So with that being said, let's go ahead and open this one up. I'm actually going to open up the image in a new tab here so that people can see it a little bit better. There we go. Let's see. All right. So this was dropped on Twitter, or on X as they know it now. And it had to do with basically a big teaser about what's coming up. They said, Observation Day 1, anomalous creature continues to grow. Efforts to understand its birth commencing. 2 beast drivers already slain. And then if you look inside like some of like the ambiguousness of like the sketch art of like that's also on the note itself, you can see it kind of looks like there's like some kind of like chemical set or chemistry set there, and it seems like alchemy, like it's like an alchemical kind of thing, like maybe it's an amalgamation or something like that. And I have a theory that may be a driving point towards what may be coming out in the not-too-distant future, and I'll share that with you guys a little bit later after we break down some more. So, with that being said, we ended up looking a little bit further into it, and they did another post. This one in particular, I believe, was on Discord that they posted it, and it says, Day 72. So there's been, like, at least a month or two that's passed by now, maybe almost a month and a half. Facing it alone, pointless. Surrounded? Divert its attention. Give it too many targets, question mark. And that I wonder if that's like a little bit of like an inkling as to what's coming up in terms of mechanical awareness of the fight itself. So like diverting its attention, maybe that's taunt. Facing a little pointless, surrounded. I don't know about surrounding it. That one seems to be a little bit interesting. Maybe similar to like how they handled Hydra. You're going to be fighting with a very massive team. You know, normally traditional teams are like 4, at most maybe 5 for like boss fights in particular. And then like with Hydra, it was like what? You got like total of 6 champions you use, right? So I wonder if something like this may be expanding upon that even more, and you have maybe an 8-man team or a 10-man team. I mean, I feel like that might be a little ridiculous, but that could be something, right? Anyways, with that being said, you know, it kind of drives the idea about like surrounding it could be something. I wonder if it's like enveloping it in something, and that would be an interesting like note. Maybe that's towards a particular a debuff, or maybe something along those lines. I'm not entirely sure. That's all speculatory, right? And then of course, giving it too many targets also kind of sounds to me like, you know, with surrounded, that could be like something that where multiple champions are at play could be the answer to it. And then if you notice, it looks like there's some kind of insignia that's kind of right there in the top right, and it looks like there's some kind of like slithering. That looks like a snake to me right there. The silhouette of a snake, and this is pretty much its entire body. But then at the bottom here, this looks like something that would be like maybe from, I want to say like antlers or like talons per se, but like maybe something from like a scorpion or whatever. And like when I think about like these different ones, and I'm gonna go back to the day 1 observation. You see down here that I can't really tell exactly what that is per se, but if I were to take the other 2 things that we're doing and talking about alchemy, the amalgamation of 2 things with, you know, chemistry or combining or like, you know, breaking down of parts or something like that, you know, that's how I kind of view like this whole fantastical approach to like alchemy in a sense, right? And then you have like 2 distinctive like features that are belonging to 2 different creatures. To me, that sounds like something that would be like experimental. And when I think of like fantasy type stuff, I think of like chimeras. So like maybe it's got the body of a serpent, but it has the tail of a scorpion, or, you know, maybe the body of a bear, or maybe even a lion, the face of a lion. Like, you know how like chimeras are in general, and that kind of threw a little bit of like a credence to my hypotheses using the information that we see right here, the images that we have right here. Now, when it looks even further here, and here's something that they said on the observation day 72. Another recovered page further proves the danger that this unseen monster poses. Champions who face it must be prepared to heal their comrades and even bring them back from the brink of death. So when we're talking about dying, I feel like that right there sounded like from the brink of death. You know what I feel like? Revive on death, ROD. As a buff, maybe have value. And I'm just throwing these little tidbits as like fun little hypotheticals that could be there. But with that being said, we also got something that was also told to us about turning to your clan leaders. And I'm actually going to try to see if I can find exactly where they posted that. I want to say it was maybe on Twitter or whatever. But they made a statement that may have been valuable for us, and actually I found it right there. So they posted on social media 4 more hints about the coming challenger in the world. Raiders, seek the first among your peers. Turn to those whom others follow into battle and call themselves leader. They're called their leader, right? And I feel like that's like, oh, that's a not to clan leader type stuff. And believe it or not, we actually got that from our side of the house, and we end up getting this right here, which it says Viper form, which kind of speaks to like that snake side. So everything kind of falling in lock, and it kind of gives us a little bit of an idea about the form of what we're going to be dealing with. And I'm actually going to go ahead and zoom here. There's going to be various different affinities. There's going to be all of them, right? So all 4 affinities at different points, maybe similar to how we have either Hydra or maybe even Clan Boss, where it changes forms. Remember, this is a Clan Boss feature, so maybe a culmination of our damage is going to contribute towards an end result, or something around the lines that could be contributing towards that, right? With that being said, Putrid Fang, his base ability, is going to attack all enemies. If there are any dead enemies, or if the initial attack kills at least 1 enemy, he does an extra hit. Already kind of dangerous. It means like it's a compounding effect of just constantly beating someone down, right? But it also has a 50% chance of placing a fear, true fear, freeze, provoke, sleep, stun, or petrification debuff on each enemy for 1 turn. This is a very dangerous set of debuffs that we're getting placed on our team here for them being able to put a hit. And if it repeats it, that could be even more dangerous, like a 50-50 chance, and that's not bad. That's good odds for, a multi-hit ability, especially if people are dead or if there's, something around those lines. So that's kind of alarming, where like survivability is very, very important for your team, Also, maybe that could be a value of like maybe resistance values, or maybe even block debuff being a little bit more valuable for this fight in particular, because it doesn't say it ignores resistance. It doesn't say it goes through block debuff as far as I'm aware so far. So maybe there's some value there, right? Stinger Cyclone attacks all enemies. This attack deals single target damage to each target individually rather than AoE damage. Before attacking, places a Hex debuff and a 100% heal reduction debuff on all enemies for 2 turns. So another one as well in terms of like getting extra value. It's going to do hits to everybody, but each view of it's going to be based off of an individual target, so it's going to be recognized as single target damage. So like in the same essence of where we have like passives like Duchess, for example, it wouldn't mitigate this even though it's hitting everybody, because it's recognizing that damage output to be something that's individually targeted. And Duchess's passive only works against what's deemed AoE damage. So in particular, someone like Duchess is not going to be viable. And to me, it feels like and I'm just going to take a little bit of break here from reading this any further, but to me, it seems like they're taking a little bit of a tip for what the players like to use as a part of their progression paths, or a part of like what we've used in the meta before when it comes to handling mechanics of a boss fight, either out-tank it or burst it down. It seems like this is kind of like targeting one part already of like, you know what, you can't hunker down and just tank this. Like, we're gonna find a way around this, and that they're playing to the advantage against our champion pool. It feels like, and that raises an eyebrow, and it's exciting because it's a challenge, but it also raises like, okay, then if our current answers are no longer the answers, what is coming up? And that's something we'll have to talk about in just a moment. Anyways, with that being said, after they place the Hex debuff and 100% hit reduction on all enemies, so it does the debuffs first and then it hits. So like you're going to get splash damage hit to you too as well. And that could be very dangerous if you're not careful. It also instantly activates all poison debuffs on all enemies for 2 turns. So kind of sticking true to that poison viper form in a sense, right? Petrification is also interesting too. If you think like Medusa type mechanics, or in this particular case, Mithrala for us, if we're thinking to like that type of mythology type approach to it, I would say this is kind of in tandem with that, because it's like very snaky themed and whatnot, right? So that's kind of interesting. Now, the other debuffs are kind of a question mark, but I wonder if there's some synergy between other forms that might have some value. Anyways, with that being said, he then transfers all debuffs from the new clan boss, they're not giving us a name, to all enemies under Hex or heal reduction debuffs placed by this skill. It increases the new clan boss's turn meter by 5% for each debuff that's successfully transferred. So we don't want him to go faster. We don't want to get debuffed, because that allows him to go faster. And then, of course, on top of that, if we are debuffed with poisons and things of the sort, he's going to capitalize off of it. So very, very dangerous. So it's damage, poison activation, and before that, you're getting heal reduce and Hex. So if you're not one of those type of people that are prepared preemptively, it seems like you're going to get punished pretty hard. So reactive measures may not be too healthy for us. So his next ability is going to be Haze of Pestilence. Attacks all enemies, but before attacking, steals all buffs from all enemies except continuous heals. It's interesting that continuous heals is a big one right there, right? Because what happens is, it looks like the way it's going to go is he's going to set up with trying to strip everybody. If you have continuous heals, that stays on board. Place 3 poison debuffs, and then, of course, a 25% poison sensitivity debuff for 3 turns. Then increases the duration of all poison debuffs on all enemies by 1 turn, and then instantly activates. So it's got that Theodore effect on it, where it's like, we're going to take the poisons, we're going to put them on you, we're going to elevate their duration, and then we're going to activate it. So activation does bring the duration down 1 turn. So putting it up means that you're going to have that extra on top of that. So got to watch out for that. Now, with that being said, this is very, very interesting in terms of like how continuous heals still holds relevance for us. So I think that's going to be kind of an interesting deemable thing there. So setting up with poisons, staling our bust before that, and then the next following ability with Cyclone Stinger being able to activate it again after doing damage, and Hex and heal reduction just sounds like it's a compounding issue. You want to stop it dead in its tracks when Haze or Pestilence happens, you know? Let's see what else we got here. So Unholy Metamorph. So this is where, if you're familiar with Mythics, it's like transforming into another form. And then it removes all buffs and debuffs, so it's a complete wipe of the board of anything that he has on it, whether it's good or bad. That's interesting, right? And that's going to lead to another form that we don't have access to seeing right now currently. Deathly Contagion, though, the passive that is going to be on this form is whenever an enemy is killed, it places 1 Necrosis stack. That's a new debuff, Necrosis, on all other enemies. Necrosis stacks cannot be resisted or blocked. So our idea about block debuffs and things of that sort are out the window if people die, which means you don't want people to die. Necrosis stacks can only be removed by reviving dead allies, so that's the only way you can counterbalance it. So Battle of Attrition is very, very important here. If multiple champions are revived, the number of Necrosis stacks removed is equal to the number of champions revived. So the more stacks you have, and the more dead people you have, the worse it gets, I'm assuming. And then on top of that, the only way to counterbalance is to bring the team back alive. So your support's going to be very important in this particular fight. All right, he has another passive, which is called Enemy of Mortality. It has a passive effect and an active effect, so there's even more on top of that. Revived enemies will have 25% less HP and 25% less turn meter. I wonder if this is like destroyed HP in a sense. It doesn't say destroyed, but I mean, I wonder if that's kind of like the mechanic they're going at with it, which is a lot. 25% is, you know, after 4 times of that, that's pretty much it, you know? Whenever the new clan boss kills an enemy, removes any block active skills debuffs from itself. So it can have block active skills placed on itself. And that is very important to note in terms of establishing a debuff system for your team. And that's going to be something that we're going to try to work off of and we're going to try to play with in mind. That means that we can do that. Keep that in mind. All right, at the start of the new clan boss's turn, transfers all poison debuffs on the new clan boss to all enemies. So any type of poison-related comps are no longer going to be viable here too as well, because at the start of the turn, he's going to transfer them. And then they also last for 2 turns no matter what. Then the active effect is it denies 1 enemy revival attempt. If multiple enemies are revived at once, it will deny 1 random one. And that's on a 5-turn cooldown. So maybe there's reason to have maybe multiple revivers so you could bait out that effect, or maybe just don't have nobody die in general. You know, that might not be a bad move. Now, here's another thing too, with Revive on Death, maybe this also triggers too whenever they're trying to bounce back from it. So even though we were talking about utilizing maybe that buff to our advantage, that could be something that, like, well, no, that's not going to work, because we're going to take that 1 death and or that 1 revive, we're going to pull it away. You can't have that one. So Aniri comps, sorry. So it seems like they kind of target a lot of things. You see that, right? All right, we got one more big one, and this was kind of an interesting one. I did a little bit of a preview read to this just to get like a little bit of an awareness of this, but it's kind of interesting, and I want to point out some key things here. So, Almighty Viper, immune to petrification, stun, freeze, sleep, provoke, block passives, fear, true fear, Hunter's Gaze. That's new. Berserk. And Enfeeble debuffs. Now, Berserk, I believe, if we're going to go into the game here for a brief moment, I believe that's the buff, or debuff, excuse me, that Odin provides to the enemy on his A1, which means that he does more damage, but he also takes more damage. And if you want to read that, you can always click that info button, scroll down to the very bottom, and you will see it right there. They receive and inflict 50% more damage. However, it's immune to that. Same thing with Enfeeble. Think about your Androck. Think about maybe even Marius. That's not going to work. This Hunter's Gaze, though, it doesn't exist currently, I believe, in the game. And that will be a new mechanic that's going to be introduced to us. And I wonder if that's like pinpoint damage for single target attacks. Might be a little bit more potent. And let me not say pinpoint, because we're not talking about the set bonus. We're talking about efficiency at damage when it comes to maybe a singular target. That could be the case. Or that could be something else altogether, and we don't have no clue about it. So Hunter's Gaze is going to be a new debuff that's going to be added to the game that we're going to need to be aware of when it comes to this particular one, because they made an effort to say, hey, it's excluded from this pool. That might be external to this, but we're going to keep it on focus to this one here too as well. Now, it's also immune to HP exchange effects and HP balancing effects, cooldown increasing effects, as well as turn meter reduction and destroy max HP effects. So you can't outboost it in terms of like removing its turn meter. You can't control it, so it's not like Dark Fae in that regard. You can't swap HPs with it. You can't destroy its max HP. And then on top of that, they added a lot more. Incoming damage inflicted by skills that scale based off of enemy max HP have a cap. So depending on the difficulty, it goes from 100,000, 120, 140, 160, 180, and then of course 200. So we're going to get a bunch of different forms in terms of difficulty ranges, and it's going to go all the way up from easy to Ultra Nightmare. Think very comparatively to Demon Lord as a boss. And then, of course, the damage taken from one tick of a 2.5% debuff cannot exceed 10,000 HP. So that's also very interesting because it's going to scale. And I have a question about this, that, like, if you look at the way poisons are incorporated into the game, it's 2.5% or 5%, right? Which is the two different versions of poison, the weaker and then the normal one, right? I don't remember for clan boss, but I remember it's roughly around like 50,000 to like 65,000 if you have like poison sensitivity on the board on the boss for Demon Lord. And then I wonder if that was capped itself. I don't believe it was, but I wonder if this means that the total raw percentage of the HP pool of the boss or bosses are going to exceed the amount to a point where our percentage of that's going to be higher. So that might give us a little bit of a clue towards what we can expect from a stat standpoint on this boss. Might be a bit of a tanky boy, you know? And then the same thing also too with HP burn. So HP burn mechanics are also, not that they're not viable, but they are not going to do as much damage as you would expect from maybe in other areas of the game. I believe like it's a percentage, or I remember at least for clan boss, I want to say it was like 75,000 damage that it did per activation. And that was something to kind of keep in mind. This is kind of cutting it almost by half, and then some actually, to where it can't exceed over 40,000 HP. Reflected damage and damage taken from War Master or Giant Slayer Masters cannot exceed 100,000 HP. Now, this one's a little bit more interesting because I want to say that it's kind of roughly in that ballpark of it being like 100 and 125, maybe 165. I'm trying to remember for like, and I'm using Demon Lord because this is when I really use a lot of these like masteries and debuffs when it comes to like clan boss mechanics, and I'm associating it to Demon Lord because that is probably the closest representation so far that we see in regards to this. And then the only other boss that I could see that being kind of close towards would be like maybe Amius, which is in, Sin City with the different forms, right? But we don't have enough information to fully kind of say it's akin to Amius. But I'm going to lean on the Demon Lord side, especially with the difficulties and how they're incorporating so many things that we have used over the years against bosses, and how they're kind of denying that in a sense. It feels very interesting, right? So I think with that being said is to set your expectations, right? Obviously, your enemy max HPs may not be hitting the full cap effect of like 10%. Maybe that is their way of saying that's their 10% equivalent. You may have to take that in mind. Obviously, we need to see some statistical evidence on the boss itself and understand what the difficulty the boss brings to the table. But with that being said, it kind of generates a very interesting dynamic where it's kind of like these passes are telling us not to do those. Not necessarily that they're not viable, but we'll have to see. Now, I wanted to kind of talk about a couple things here. Reflected damage. Damage and damage taken from those are also, they cannot exceed that. I think we read that already. The damage taken from smite debuffs cannot exceed 100,000 HP, so that's one other really big debuff, damage of debuff that would be applied to boss. And this is really good for high HP targets, This one scales differently based on the boss too as well, but I've seen it go as high as like 350,000 to 400-some thousand. It goes pretty high. And of course, it's also going to scale according to the boss difficulty itself. And that's pretty much that's it for the boss. Now, I want to talk about this, at least for this form. I want to talk about some chances or some options that may be helpful that, just from a spitball glance for this particular form, may have some value. Now, one of the things we notice is that it strips and then it places debuffs on the enemy. So obviously, cleansers are going to be very valuable here, or preventative measures are going to be very valuable here. And I wanted to bring some light to some key champions that may have some value. And I'm going to go off the unorthodox, and we're going to kind of line towards more probably realistic ones that automatically kind of set the tone for it, and I'm going to kind of talk about why I think they may be viable. So, Elva, I feel like she's going to be a very strong champion because not only does she have the cleanse, she has the ability to revive, of course buffs, she has a good speed aura, right? But her A1 has continuous heals on it, and it places on the lowest target, right? So, when you look at this A3 in particular, it does not remove continuous heals, which may be a saving grace for your team, being able to keep your team going with continuous heals. And then once these debuffs are being applied to your team, she has that bounce back, that reactive, that responsive mechanic. So the way you could do it is that like when the boss goes and he does this A3 strips, you can follow up with Elva at the top of the turn, cleanse everybody, and now you have block debuffs for the second ability that's going to come up, right? So you're already protected there. So you're not going to have any other poisons that are going to go on in terms of activating from the Stinger Cyclone. And then you're also going to mitigate Hex and heal reduction going on your champions too as well, meaning your continuous heals that you're going to be applying from Elva are going to still apply. So that's good survivability there too as well, right? And then, of course, she also, with the revive, helps out with the Necrosis X in the event your team does kind of hit a little bit of a pitfall. And the bounce back mechanic kind of circumvents itself. And then also, you know, it heals each ally by 10% of the max HP each turn. It's really good survivability. Unfortunately, the Veil side of things does not really apply to this form because he's attacking all enemies at all times, you know. It's basically what this means, right? So, very, very interesting. Now, a drawback to this is this passive where on a 5-turn cooldown with enemies of mortality, this one enemy revival will get denied. Maybe you can use this as a champion to bait out that failed attempt, right? And then you can follow up with another champion that's a AoE reviver, and you can bring everybody up at the same time. Which brings me to my next choice. I'm actually going to dip over to our Lizard Boys, and I'm going to talk about someone that's a little bit different. Our Duchess equivalent at the time of his release, and he might actually have some big value here, Pythion. So the same thing applies to him, where if you get debuffs and all that stuff like that, he can cleanse it, but he also capitalizes off of the total quantity of debuffs that he's cleansing, because it scales off of that for each debuff removed. You can get block debuffs as well as a big burst of heal, keeping your team going. Now, he doesn't provide the continuous heals like Elva does, but his A1 over the course of a fight, as long as you're protected from that heal reduction, you'll net that extra HP that he's going to constantly give out from healing off of his A1. And that's like 10% for each hit, right? And that'll go up. So 10% for the lowest target across the board for another like, you know, 10% each time he does his A1. So very good value. Big AoE with strength to help you kind of tank through some of the hits, as well as that quick turn meter to allow you to get back into the fight. And then, of course, he has a mitigative passive, which is just straight up, hey, as long as we got buffs, you're going to get a stacking effect. So this is kind of like a complement that I think would supersede even Duchess's passive in some of the particular abilities. Like if you're looking at Stinger Cyclone again, this does singular target damage. Well, he gets that passive mitigation because it's just a flat denial, right? Whereas with Duchess, that doesn't really stop it. Now, A1 and A3, it looks like Duchess will still work there. So I think she's still worth a nod. Now, if you're having to play through revives here, Duchess, I feel like, is a little bit of a concern because she has to revive everybody, but they don't get any turn meter boost, and that's a little bit of a concern. 70% HP and continuous heals, though, that sticks on the team. That's great. She also provides that block debuff as a preventative measure, but remember, that strip still kind of comes into play, and that's a little bit of a concern there, right? Now, with this being said, though, these champions are all susceptible to an issue that exists when it comes to buff strips, right? You could try to play any kind of way that you would want, but to be honest with you, outside of maybe resisting this, it's kind of difficult to stop that, and not everybody can go resistance on all champions, unless your account's pretty advanced, right? Now, for those that were around earlier this year, or towards the beginning of the year, we had got a champion called the Latrion Blademaster, which was a champion that has the ability, I believe, to have protected buffs. So he's one of the only champions that I know that's exclusively like this. So to be even more preventative, you can maybe have this guy go before the boss at the beginning of the turn, and as long as this is protected, which it will be, since we're going against the boss mechanic, he's going to try to strip, and it's protected. It's not going to go anywhere. So you don't get any poisons. You don't get any buff strip, and you're good to go. Now, you still have to tank that on-hit damage, but you cover at least majority of the mechanics, right? So now, at this point, it's just mitigation and survivability, right? On top of that, too, the shields, in the event that you do have a little bit of poisons come through, it'll go through the shield first before it touches the actual HP. The same thing with on-hit targets, right? And, of course, increased defense makes it a little bit more easier. And then it scales off of him, so it's also really, really good. And then, of course, it increases the duration of 2 random buffs on each ally per turn, which may be synchronized with other buff extenders. You have a permanent block debuff on your team, keeping your team going. And then, of course, whenever a debuff is placed, he's also going to do that. But I like the little heal here whenever a debuff is expired or removed. So the cleanser's aspect side of things. Maybe you use him as your preemptive and then use the other champions that I mentioned as responsive. Now, another thing I think would be really, really good for this particular mechanic right now, just in theory, is going to be a set bonus, believe it or not. And we're going to refer to Our Lady Mikage for this one. Protection. 9-piece protection, and even lower stage of that, 6-piece and, of course, 4-piece, has a chance to provide a protective buff. Now, consistency will vary. Obviously, it's not 100% guaranteed compared to Latrion, but it is an alternative measure where maybe you can put your Elva, your Pytheon in those protected versions, and now those block debuffs that normally would be strippable are protected, right? And that gives you some place of maybe if you don't have that Elatron, you can use that as an advantage towards your team being able to kind of maybe mitigate some of the mechanics of this boss. You know, I think that's very interesting, right? Now, as for the poisons themselves, as long as you're blocking them, you're good. Of course, you can capitalize off on the healing using Pytheon. The necrosis side of things, I feel like Revive on Death is a mechanic that's only used in some very specific scenarios. And I thought about a Neri a while back when I saw that, and I was like, you know what? That'd be really cool. But the thing about her is that hers is a one and done for the one that is an ally, and you can kind of manipulate this by having like priority positioning, right? But the thing is, though, is that even if it's only on one particular champion, it's going to go ahead and straight up deny that. And I think that was kind of an interesting dynamic here with enemy immortality, that it kind of removes her from the table. However, even with that being said, if she straight up survives and that passive procs and it removes the deny you can still technically revive a secondary support, like maybe that Duchess or maybe that Elva or Pytheon in that matter. Bring them up, reset their cooldowns, and then rinse repeat, where they bounce back style. Additionally speaking, if we were just going to go off of it, I'm going to give some nods to some champions that I think might be noteworthy of just looking at what could be valuable from a Revive on Death standpoint. So think about maybe Mother Cybele, who can provide it to everybody, you know, including increased defense for more survivability. And then she can bring some other things like a health swap to kind of keep your team going. Maybe one of your boys are about to die, or maybe you're that really important support you don't want to die. You can swap healths and let Mother Cybele get kicked the bucket, and then she's still in there. But it also places continuous heals, which makes this a little bit more valuable in the sense that maybe you can play through those mechanics of this fight. Another one that I'll give a nod towards, and this is kind of like a not so much I would give it a direct answer as being valuable, would be like maybe a Revive on Death AoE again for all allies through Lightsworn. Now, it is a 4-turn cooldown, that's kind of a little bit of a concern. I think this one's also going to be down to a 3-turn cooldown, so there's obviously a slight advantage for the Legendary. But it is something noteworthy to kind of keep in mind. Another thing I was going to kind of knock at in terms of like maybe they were trying to find value would be like maybe someone who can do multiple things within one set, right? So with Amius, we got flipped quite a bit, and I'm trying not to associate these bosses together, but I'm using commonality as a reference point, you know? Maybe through the course of a fight, having some kind of viability with being able to do some on-point damage. Maybe there's a period where there's a damage check, for example. Maybe having someone like Gallius being able to play that support utility role with Revive on Death, restoring destroyed max HP, which could be really valuable depending on if it's viewed as much. You know, we had revived enemies take 25% less HP. It's not necessarily saying destroyed HP, but it could be. And maybe that could be a way to bounce back. And it also gives you that Revive on Death, so you can kind of bait a way around and manipulate that passive a little bit more effectively, right? On top of that, too, Provoke and Unkillable, you know, giving yourself a little bit of something to work with there. And then he does do that enemy max HP with the decreased speed, but more so the utility aspect behind it, which is not too bad. And I feel like everything that they pinpointed with this particular mechanic had something to do with Gallius, and that's what I was like, you know what? He's kind of like shunned on because they took an incredible champion at the beginning of when he was first announced, and through people playtesting on the test servers, and then when he got released, they were like, nope, we had to bring him down to earth, and they brought him too far down to earth to a point where he's kind of smelling the dust a little bit, you know? Now, this could be a great opportunity to allow him to kind of have a place to shine, and I feel like maybe that could be very interesting. So, one thing I also looked at is that with him being in his passive form on his second form, remember there might be a mechanic with Amy's that causes him to flip. As long as he got decreased defense out, then they can't place these debuffs on him. And that sounds very, very similar to his A1, right? And I felt like that could be something that's kind of interesting for a dynamic when it comes to addressing the mechanical output of the fight itself. And I feel like he has like something that kind of, I wouldn't say it exactly alludes to every mechanic of the boss, but it gives you something that's a responsive approach to it. Now, obviously we want to be preemptive, and maybe we'll find a formula that will allow us to do it when we get to testing this boss. But it is something that's very interesting to kind of explore. And I thought that would be a very unique case and scenario where you can kind of try to plug and play and match some unorthodox picks that could give you something, you know? And then, of course, there's also a lot of other options that we could try to incorporate and place in there. But I thought this would be a great start to kind of maybe talk about some possibilities that could introduce some really, really cool dynamics. And it might be copium. At the end of the day, I'm just kind of having fun with tinkering with, like, all right, I see all these mechanics. Who has something that approaches that? And I just started looking down the list of my own roster and just saw what, like, well, maybe this, maybe that, maybe this, you know. And then that's kind of what we kind of saw. And I want to just give some nods towards it. And I thought that was pretty cool. Anyways, with that being said, you guys let me know. How do you feel about this Viper form boss mechanic style that we're going to be approaching? Is it going to be a Chimera? I feel like the screenshots that we saw, particularly with this one, for example, shows like you could definitely tell that's a snake right there. I see his head and everything. I see the little teeth, you know, and then I see like the rest of the body right here. This looks like a very scaly version of the like the bottom end of like a snake, you know. And then, of course, right here, this looks like this could be like the talons to, or maybe even like the arms of like a scorpion or something. It's like, you know what I mean? Like it's like two animals mixed in together, you know what I mean? Two species, two creatures. And I feel like that could be a very, very good inclination that we are maybe dealing with a Chimera. That's my guess. That's my guess at the very least. I have no proof, obviously, outside of what we've been shown today. But as always, you guys let me know what you guys think. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and as always, always remember, stay ascended.